problem of sin. And as we talked about that and the issue of sin and moral evil in the world, my wife walked through and looked at where I was doing my work for this, and she saw the explosion of notes all over the table, and she said, "What's going on here?" And I said, "Oh, Joanne," I said, "taking and actually distilling this down." She said to me, she said, "John, don't overwhelm people, okay? Keep it short." She says, "If you have to say it over a period of time, say it over a period of time rather than trying to get everything in at once." And so I thought, okay, so I'm going to try and keep things short and keep things reasonable and not be at 10:55 saying, "Well, I've got 2 more minutes, I can say 3 more things," sort of thing. So anyways, so this is actually, it's funny, sideline. Marcy said to me in the ladies' Bible study that she is actually finding herself becoming a little bit more like me in the fact that she doesn't get things said as fast as she kind of feels like she's supposed to say them, because she says, the discussion happens and things expand, and she justified it all the same way I do. And she said, "What's the use of saying it all if people don't understand?" Right. So it's like working to work through this and make sure that we provide good and reasoned and thoughtful and biblical answers. Maybe I should put biblical out front of that, but also good, reasoned, and thoughtful. And last week we defined this word sin. We defined it using the Kids Club definition, which, Michaela, is okay, anything that you think, say, or do that breaks God's commands. And we've used this statement to help our kids understand language, because we don't want just to throw out terms and have those terms develop develop meaning that or not have meaning to them. So that's how we defined it. And as we defined it, that's a simpler way for kids to understand really what the philosophers would say, which is, I shouldn't say all the philosophers, but Christian philosophers would generally say, as they look at this word sin, as they try to attach the meaning to it, they would say that sin is the breaking of the good. Okay? So sin in itself is the negation of, the destruction of that which is good. The good is the positive, sin is the negation of the good. And so we think about this, and we think about the fact that as we look biblically, the creation account starts out in Genesis chapter 1, and it repeats at the ends of days 1 through 6. What? Or actually right through to the very end. What does it say at the end? Yes. Hey, yes, and God looked and saw, and it was good. And then on day 6, of course, at the completion of creation, as he takes a look and sees he's created Adam and Eve, humanity as kind of the pinnacle, the last part of his creative work, and it says there, and it was very good. And then as we move on, I mean, we see this idea developed through scriptures. We know that there is a negation takes place, and that negation spreads throughout humankind. And so when Jesus is talking to a Pharisee who comes up to him and says, "Good teacher," Jesus says what? Pardon? He says, "Why do you call me good? There is none good except God," because this has become the moral state of humankind. And in Romans chapter 3, we read, "There is none righteous, not even one. There's none who understands. There's none who seeks after God," or seeks after the one who is ultimate goodness. And so we have this picture for us. And if you take a look, we're doing our discussion here to some degree in comparison to other religions and other worldviews. And other religions and other worldviews see a problem. And as they see that problem, they have different words for it. So for instance, if you were in Hinduism or Buddhism, both religions actually use the same term, at least their central term, and then there's other terms around it. But the Hindus and Buddhists use the term papa when they talk about what we would call sin. They use the word papa. And then Islam uses the word darb. Okay, and so we see these words that are used, and really for human beings, there has been thousands of years of observing the brokenness and the moral wrongdoing of humankind. People's ability to hurt others, people's ability to self-destruct, this is all being very observable. One of the things that I have said to different people when I have been in conversation with them, and it's interesting because sometimes here in our country, you get people who try to be blind optimists, try to almost turn their back on reality. And one of the things that I've said to people is sin is the most empirically observable reality of humankind. It is something that you can see every single day, whether you see it inside of your home and family relations and relationships in the neighborhood and in the community, or whether you turn on the news, whatever you might be, we see the realities of this kind of brokenness. And it's like you have to be deliberately downplaying these realities in order not to acknowledge them. And we believe that the Bible, the biblical worldview, best explains and takes most seriously the human condition. It provides the clearest answers, and it's the best explanation of, and it takes most seriously what's going on inside of the human condition. And I would say as we look at that, not only does the Bible provide the best diagnosis, but Jesus is the only meaningful answer ultimately to the problem. As we look at the world, as we look at ourselves, the Word best explains and most fully explains what we observe, and Jesus is ultimately the only solution, the only whole and complete solution, because we try to find solutions over and over and over again, and as we try to find those solutions over and over again, I think that we often find ourselves deeply, if we're honest, deeply self-disappointed when we look for those solutions apart from Jesus. I think it's an interesting one to consider as far as English etymology is concerned. The word fake. So the word fake actually initially has to do with the Hindu holy man who is a fakir, a fakir, a fake. Okay, so at the height of holiness, some of what actually ends up being the outward display covers up what inwardly is still, it's a significant problem for every one of us. And as we look to Scripture, the biblical worldview, the Word, most fully describes what sin really is. I gave you words just a couple of minutes ago to describe the moral wrong we see in the world as those words are developed inside of other worldviews. But while they have those words, let's understand this about their meaning and their understanding of the concept of sin. Hindus, Buddhists, and the material atheist don't think of sin the way that the Bible does. Okay, this is not to say, by the way, when I say this, this is not to say that you won't meet admirable individuals in any one of those worldviews. This doesn't mean that you won't meet people and say, that guy's a good guy, or that lady's a really nice person. I am not disputing that at all. But as we think through these things and understand these things, the Hindu, the Buddhist, and the material atheist don't think of sin the way that the Bible does. They will use the language of malice, they will use the language of evil, and they can't help it because it's too much the human experience. They will even experience moral outrage because we can't help it. But their explanation of the human condition and reality is inconsistent with their own language because they don't see sin as a moral reality. Now, I want you to stop and I want you to think about that. Those worldviews, and I classed those worldviews. I didn't touch Islam at this point, and Islam has other issues. But when we take a look at it, Buddhists, Hindus, and let's understand, I mean, the world's, we are a population that is going to experience more neighbors who are from a Hindu background because India is the world's largest nation now. And when we take a look at this, Buddhists, Hindus, and those who come from a material atheist background do not ultimately see sin as a moral reality. And let me explain to you what I mean in each of these cases. Inside of Buddhism, all of this, you and I, the personal, is ultimately illusion. Okay, and we talked about that a little bit inside of the concept of personhood. So existence ultimately is an illusion. Now, suffering should be addressed and suffering should be prevented, but sin isn't a moral issue, it's actually a skill and knowledge issue. If you knew more, if you were more enlightened, then everything would be okay. If you were more detached from the illusion, then everything would be okay. In fact, if you do know anything culturally about those cultures, you might have heard more than once the phrase Buddhist detachment used. Because of the idea that what happens is ultimately, when it comes to sin, what we call sin, the solution inside of Buddhism is ultimately a detachment from the illusion of self and the accompanying desires. And you deal with the problem as you become more and more detached from the illusion. So it's almost like you're saying, okay, so none of this is real. Being hungry isn't real. Being thirsty isn't real. None of this is real. Even the I isn't real. By the I, I mean the me. That's not real. Sin isn't real. Suffering in practical terms happens and we need to address it, but ultimately it's not real. And so the whole thing then becomes, okay, let's develop detachment to all of this as the means to fix it. In Hinduism, you have something the same. Sin is not moral, personal evil so much as it is simply the absence of enlightenment. When you move toward enlightenment, then you deal with the sin issue. And you know what? That's not that different in some ways from material atheism. We have moved into a postmodernist world, but I still, remember seeing again and again this picture almost of education as salvation. If you just educate people enough, you'll get rid of all the bad. And I think we've become more cynical now in the postmodern era. But when I was younger, that was very much what was flowing out of a modernist mindset, that you wanted to transform and fix everything. Education was key. And I'm not saying that education isn't good and that it isn't useful. But I don't think education and enlightenment decreases sin. I think it changes the nature of it, changes what's more likely to happen. Maybe you find more white-collar ways to do your sin rather than blue-collar ways to do your sin, but I don't think it changes it that much. Yes, Daryl? Yeah, yeah. Well, and this is where what happens is, at least in part, there's the redefining of morality. And what's interesting as atheists redefine morality is that they actually are borrowing and stealing language from a worldview that's not theirs to talk in moral terms. Because, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. For material atheism, if there is no God, if there is no creator behind all of this, who is good, who shows us what good is, then sin is only an agreed upon construction of values by the majority of a population of animals called humans. Really, what is sin and what is good is only that which is defined by moral vote. So if the majority votes in one direction, then that group of animals says this is good and that is bad. But if the majority votes in another direction, then maybe what was sin in one set of people's minds is good in another set of people's minds. Can you think of any times when the majority chose what we would say is definitely wrong? Has it ever happened in human history? Yes. Well, I've got to be very careful about this because they always talk about the fact that when you, as soon as you relate and reduce things to Nazism, you've gone to full Godwinism. You might not have heard that term or not. Godwin's law is basically you can't have a discussion once you reduce anything to Nazism. But the reality is, if you take a look at what has gone on inside of populations, majorities don't always get it right. So what happens is material atheism borrows the language of Scripture, and material atheists still experience moral outrage, and material atheists might even do moral good. But they don't really have morality. There is no such thing as actual morality if we are only highly advanced organisms. You can borrow the language, but you don't actually meaningfully have moral good or moral evil. And this is the effect of material atheism as it has been perpetrated in so many cases in places of higher learning, as it has been pushed by ideologues. The effect is that many times when we have moral conversations, if you have moral conversations with your neighbors, even though they might not have realized that this is the case, they will say, well, the law allows it, so it's good. And you think about that. The law allows it, so it must be okay. And yes. Right, exactly. So you take a look at this, and that is ultimately saying the will of the 51%, or the agreement of the 51%, is the basis for what we will construct and call morality. So in all of these cases, what we're dealing with is, I would say we're dealing with stuff that ultimately presents the concept of sin as an illusion. Biblically, our worldview is this: yes, people make mistakes. Yes, people lack education. Yes, there can be all of these things that are part of it, but we know that there's more. It's not just a lack of knowledge. It's not just a lack of skill. It's not just disagreement with the majority. So explain to me then, what is it? You don't have to give me a comprehensive answer, but as you think about it, what ultimately then would we say sin is? And yes, everything we think, say, or do that breaks God's command. But give me something of the motivation or the drive behind it. Pardon? Selfish desires? Okay. Okay. Pride? Okay. Okay. Yes. Okay. We would hold that there is actually something, and this goes with this concept of evil. There is personal relationship and breaking of relationship and defiance of relationship that goes on here, and rebellion against relationship that's a part of this. It is an interesting thing because we understand, and the biblical worldview understands evil and sin ultimately not just as mistakes, but as moving into the realm of deliberate personal offense against. And that's where you even think about the fact that ultimately evil is personified. Who is evil personified in? Tell me. Who is evil personified in? Pinnacle evil. You know, it's going to come. Yes, Dorcas. Exactly. We look and we say there is ultimately actually it's not just a concept. It actually is pinnacleized in a person. Evil is personified in Satan. So we don't see just mistakes, and we experience an innate moral awareness of rebellion against the good that we know. We experience an innate moral awareness of deliberately doing wrong, even of intentional, of intentionally hiding things under the guise of ignorance, but knowing that we are suppressing knowledge. We know that we're suppressing what we know in order to do wrong. So we take a look in Psalm chapter 36, and I brought this one up just because I read it this week as I was following through on our reading for the week, and this one, it just kind of struck me, and I thought, wow, this really fits with the nature of who we are as we think about this issue of sin and what sin is in us. And it says in Psalm 36, verses 1 through 4, it says, "Transgression speaks to the wicked deep in his heart. There is no fear of God before his eyes, for he flatters himself in his own eyes that his iniquity cannot be found out and hated. The words of his mouth are trouble and deceit. He has ceased to act wisely and do good. He plots trouble while on his bed. He sets himself in a way that is not good. He does not reject evil." And all of this is a picture poetically for us of consciousness when it comes to evil, of deliberateness, of actual personal drives and personal intent. And this is a useful thing for us to get. We think that sin is real. We think that there actually is morality, and that morality has its roots down into personhood. And morality and personhood are explicitly bound together. We don't believe in the illusion of personhood and thus the illusion of sin. We don't believe that enlightenment alone is the cure, because you can be as smart and as educated as anything. You can be morally, you can be a great moral philosopher when it comes to producing academic tracts and be able to define all the fine points of it. But we come back to the fact that there is a deliberateness of rebellion and decision and choice. And so Cain, in Genesis chapter 4, God warns Cain, and he says, hey, sin's crouching at your door, Cain. You must resist it. You must master it. or it's going to master you. We see Noah and the words in Genesis chapter 6, as God looks on the world, and it says, and he sees the world, and he sees only evil continually. And then we see Paul, and Paul says, wherefore as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, because all have sinned. And we have this sense of the fact that there is something that is moral here. It's not just a lack of enlightenment. And often, I will say, going back to the material atheist view of morality as a construct based on majority opinion, often we would observe that going against the majority opinion and construction is the more moral action. There are plenty of times when the person who is the most moral is the person who says no to the majority. This has historically been the case. So, you stop and think about this whole idea of sin as simply being a lack of enlightenment, sin as simply being a failure to be where you should be when it comes to your knowledge basis or whatever it might be. Do smart, morally educated people with an expansive knowledge of what to do and what not to do ever sin? You're laughing as I ask that question because it's such an obvious question. Do wealthy, university-educated students ever sin? Does the social upper crust ever sin? Do Christian theologians ever sin? I mean, the reality is that, and this is why the scripture says, for instance, Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1, he says, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And that's not a denigration of knowledge, but that's just the reality that the fact is, this is not the moral cure. And he says that, by the way, when he says knowledge puffs up, but love builds up, he says that because he's talking to a heresy, a Christian heresy at that point, called Gnosticism, which is knowledge. And that whole Christian heresy, the whole idea there is, if you just get enlightened enough, then you will detach from physical realities, from the illusion of physical. And it's Gnosticism sounds an awful lot like Buddhism, an awful lot like Hinduism in its worldview assumptions. If you just get to that special enlightened degree of knowledge, you will detach from sin and from evil. Hebrews chapter 6 is a good one to think about, where in Hebrews chapter 6 it's called one of the warning it's one of the warning passages of Hebrews, and it says it's impossible for those who have once been enlightened, if they trample on the cross of Jesus Christ, to be renewed again to salvation. In other words, it doesn't matter how much you know, doesn't matter how much you've been able to experience inside of the spiritual community. The fact is, you turn your back on the grace of God in the cross of Christ, and you have no solution to your sin problem. That's where you are. There is no solution to the sin problem apart from the grace of God and the cross of Christ. So, I'm going to stop, okay? But yeah, I better stop, okay? Anyways, let's take a moment and have a word of prayer, and thank you for your patience as we talk through this and think through this. If questions come up, if I cause questions that you would like to ask in the course of this, if you didn't put your hand up and ask them here, but you'd like to ask them, please feel free to talk with me afterward. But let's take a moment and pray. Actually, you probably won't find that you'll catch me right now, because I've got to go to the kitchen to make sure that the meal's going okay. But that doesn't mean sampling it, Nettie. I know she was thinking that, so yeah, let's pray. Father, thank you for allowing us to take time to be in your truth, and I pray that we would be people who are thinking very, very well and carefully, not because ultimately our brilliance is of any value, but because of the fact that we have so much to learn and understand about you and your goodness, about reality, and about the world that we live in. And we want to be people who reflect on these things and think well into these issues so that we will be people who are then following Christ and living well. Help us to be people who think carefully and who recognize always that your truth has the answers and the best answers to the big questions of this life that we live. I pray this in Jesus' name.